Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today. This is your host Nino, humbly inviting you to explore with me the beauty of Windows 95, a most influential operating system that came out 30 years ago. And still after 3 decades, it remains influential in quite a few design respects. And I believe you might find it interesting to explore what it was all about, what caused the marketing craze at the time, besides budgets, what made Microsoft so popular so as to become the king of personal computer operating systems for decades thereafter. For it is without question that this was the system that made Microsoft. It had competition from Apple, later from BEOS, even my beloved Linux, even IBM's OS/2, none of these managed to really push down Microsoft from the throne it had assumed thereby, and it is only in the modern day and age where we are starting to see a little bit more variety in terms of what systems people can use. And so one might ask oneself, why? What was so special about it? When we look at this shell, we might almost say, that's what a graphical user interface looks like. Why should we bother? Well, it might help comparing that with what there was before. For it is certainly well known that this is not the first graphical user interface of Microsoft. And before, that is in the Windows 3 days, 3.1, 3.11, even Windows 2 days, you are having a shell called the Program Manager, which is in fact still included with Windows 95, and you can have therefore a quite clear impression what the system would have looked like if it had been devised in the traditional way. You would be having this program manager, except that you wouldn't be having a taskbar. It would be just this thing, and there you would be having tons of windows which each do something. And while it is possible certainly to explore what each one of them does, it is still somewhat difficult to imagine to say, hey, I'm in control of my system, I know exactly what is happening there. In reality, things look, one could say, chaotic. So the old design was suitable for previous systems which had fewer programs and fewer files to deal with, but as user requirements grew, as people simply had more programs, more files, more settings, more wishes regarding connectivity and multimedia, this called for a redesign and something new. And in this regard, what Microsoft came up with here is rather much what still is imitated in many other GUIs, in that you're having here a desktop on which you can put icons as opposed to what you saw in the program manager. You are having this taskbar down there where you see what is running. You are having a little place here at the corner showing you what programs are sort of running in the background. And you're having the start button, which is allowing you a much more tree-structured traversal of what is present on the system, rather than having to mess about with a great collection of many windows. So if you just follow here the topics and categories, then you can much rather see what you're doing and keep track of it. It of course continued to retain compatibility with MS-DOS, although itself it is hailed as Microsoft's first 32-bit operating system, which was a big issue at the time. It was a time of revolution from a set of older hardware, the world of 16 bits, towards the world of 32 bits, which was a giant leap in terms of addressing space and therefore possibilities what you could really do with your computer. You could, of course, still access traditional DOS programs. And I must admit that I am very fond of the editor which comes by default with it. What is that? So you could still use such programs which was a major necessity at the time, as the world was still very much marked by their use professionally as well as privately. And some competitors did not handle that all that well, and it is one of the reasons for their demise, I must frankly say. But it was still a 32-bit operating system that much better segregated processes from each other and which had clearly better multitasking. For instance, if one accesses the classical program DOS debug, which allows you manipulation of the CPU registers or a view at the RAM in hexadecimal form, then with this program in the past, you could easily crash the computer, for instance, calling DOS interrupt 20 by assembling here this instruction and then just simply jumping to it. But here, we are simply getting the sign of program terminated normally, and we get no such horrors of random reboots just because some program did not wish to cooperatively multitask with another and terminate normally, but instead decided to drag the entire machine into the abyss. Now, this of course is famously not just DOS, but this is the command line interface of Windows, at that time command.com, no PowerShell, no CMD.EXE, and it did feature, of course, also pure Windows command line applications, such as here pinging a well-known DNS server. So yeah, we have network connectivity as of the present. And you could still access this type of programs, but now in a better subdivided environment. In fact, it was so well isolated that it could note that you are using a program, but it could not always figure out what you were doing there, and it could not guarantee that it could end these programs in a civilized fashion. So if I don't exit from the window itself, but just simply try to close it with the button, I'm getting something which a lot of people were plagued with at the time, this dialog box. If you shut it down, who knows what horrors may happen. But if you now press no, which is the pre-decided answer, you're back in your program. And if you try to close it again, then back you are at this dialog box and you're circling until you realize, yeah, most cases you can just press yes and nothing terrible happens. Now, that may seem trivial today, but at the time, many people were not yet acquainted with computers all that well, and this was all rather puzzling. Nonetheless, it was easier to use to many rather than the pure command line interfaces, although DOS had already started to live an interesting life as an operating system mainly with text user interfaces, like the DOS editor which I showed you. So it's not 100% clear whether there wouldn't have come out an interesting alternative GUI development that way, but Microsoft clearly cut it short by introducing this system. Now, if you want to see a little bit what this 32-bit versus 16-bit story is all about, I have brought you here a little demonstration, EXE-Lisp+. Now, I love EXE-Lisp, for it is a very nice implementation of my favorite programming language, Lisp, famous for artificial intelligence accomplishments since the 60s and mainly 70s. There I'm having two versions of EXE-Lisp+. This one which you're seeing in front of you is the 16-bit version, whereas the other one is the 32-bit version. You see, they look nearly identical. But if I now ask a room, that is, how much space do I have within this Lisp to create my objects, I'm getting here 7,840 objects. Whereas in the other one, ask a room, I'm getting 10,640. So having a the space in this case gives me not quite half, but certainly something like a third more space to deal with, and that certainly was an advantage that mattered. You already had a lot of nice programming tools at the time. I have shown you Lisp now, but I can also show you Prolog, for instance. This was the time when one did not yet have all those nice, funky, open source programming implementations. Nowadays one is really pampered, but at the time one had to look for what one can find, and this is in fact the first implementation that I chanced upon when I was looking for Prolog. And Prolog is a famous symbolic logic programming language where you're giving relations and then you can check things whether they correspond to these relations and how they correspond. You're having here a little database of facts and then you're asking questions. For instance, I'm saying there are 4 men, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Diogenes, and then I'm asking, is there a man and what man is there? Tell me. And if I then run the whole thing with a run symbol, then I am getting here, yeah, there is a guy and he's called Socrates. And I can continue asking questions with F8. I can ask, is there anybody else? Alternative answers. I'm getting Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Diogenes. But if I continue to tease it, it will say no, there's nobody further. And that allowed for a lot of interesting compositions in terms of what is nowadays referred to as GOFAE, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which was greatly based on such symbolic relations. Nowadays, a lot of these tasks are in one way or another implemented in databases, which are also used to show you such relations, and also such logical contingencies are taken into account, just not that much in a Prolog interpreter explicitly, but this being left, this was a nice little graphical environment. You had that for a lot of things, though perhaps the most famous programming environment at that time, which everybody sort of had because it was just coming with Windows 95 and later 98, is QBasic. Here you see me trigger the QBasic window. This is just a normal basic interpreter. And this came with Windows. And you could, in an easy fashion, just simply create your own programs. Now, these were DOS programs, evidently. But it did come with a nice help screen with nice possibilities to learn the language. And it is therefore ironic that perhaps one of the most famous environments for Windows 95 that you could just get like that were not graphical, but were in fact text-only environments. There were, of course, also more serious programming options offered at the time, like the Whatcom C compiler that I shall demonstrate to you in a second. So what you're seeing in front of you is the famous Whatcom C and C++ compiler. In this case, just going to display a little hello world type message. It was well known at the time for being the system on which Doom was compiled for Windows. So if we then run it, we're getting hello there, and it's waiting for us to press a key, and it terminates. You could not collect IDEs the way people do nowadays, simply because these things could easily take up half your disk space. Now, that is not the only thing you could do, though, creating easily programs and more modern IDEs, but also in the area of multimedia, things had advanced. And having changed CDs now, allow me to present you with the Encyclopedia Microsoft Encarta 95, which for more modern audiences you can very much imagine like something akin to Wikipedia on a disk. This was a program that worked surprisingly well with the limited resources presented to it. And one must say, generally speaking, in classical times, Microsoft was very good at getting a lot of user-facing performance from extremely limited resources. That is, you had other operating systems whose multitasking was better, whose security was better, and so on and so forth. But here you're having an operating system that can work comfortably with 8 or 16 megabytes of RAM. It could even work on a 386, presenting you with a graphical shell, and where you could, explore articles, click hyperlinks, like for instance here, if I click on the red text for fiber, I will get to another article, and generally speaking, offer you an experience which was only rivaled by much more powerful and hence also much more expensive machines of the competition. And the question is whether you all that much bother with the technical details, or whether as a user you would be more interested in looking at some pictures, reading some text, and so on and so forth. So I think that that was one of the chief advantages of Windows 95 in comparison to its competition, that for the small resources at the time, it offered actually quite something. And that famously, certainly not only in the area of such multimedia programs, but also in the classical office world, where if I now start Word 97, I had to take 97, you will see in a second why, we can even experience something particularly special. If I click on the help button, there we are greeted by the slightly smug look of the grandfather of the large language models. So, who is the creator of Word? You were not asking such questions at the time, because quite simply this thing would only be answering how to format things. But I want to misuse it a little bit and torture it and see how it does with a question that I don't expect it to know the answer to. No, it does not know. Okay, so how do I print a title in bold? And dear Clippy should now act as a little search engine, and you see, it was particularly bad even at that, even then. It is telling me everything except how to print something in bold, and it's just looking sort of funnily here at me. So let me do away with good Clippy. Oh yes, I did click here so that you go away, please. Yeah. And then I could type some text and correct my mistakes. That was a big thing at the time, because people were still largely using typewriters, where when you make a mistake, well, things get a bit cumbersome one way or the other. The possibility to do spreadsheet calculations via Excel is, of course, one of the classical uses of computers, and you could say that VisiCalc greatly contributed to the sale of Apple II computers, which were used for such purposes for a long time already before. You had a lot of spreadsheet programs. And in terms of Excel, affairs are quite interesting, because it was by no means clear that it would be a program that would, so to say, win the battle for spreadsheets. There were other programs like Lotus 123. They were not graphical, and it is therefore not obvious that people would give up that what they had used since the 80s in order to use this new thing. And I think I'm just going to slaughter this Clippy at some point, because my mouse becomes invisible here and I really want to get rid of him, but that's so hard. Let me slaughter Clippy off screen. The Office programs at the time certainly did benefit from the larger memory address space, but certainly also from the possibility to save your files not anymore just in the 8.3 file name format, but to be able to find longer names for them. Of course, Windows came with the usual and sundry amusements, such as the Paint program. My choppy smile, yeah? Terrible. No, that should not be saved. Or the Minesweeper program, which is actually, not as simple as one may wish. And I'm incredibly in disbelief why it took me so long to blow up. There is, of course, also a nice calculator to torture. Like, for instance, you say, oh, you're a scientific calculator. Well, then how about me computing here the factorial of 10. Will it be able to do that? Yes, but if I want to have the factorial of 100, oh, I did not expect that. I must say I'm impressed. Well, then the calculator shall have won. That was an honorable battle. The other thing, of course, which it did offer, and which was perhaps even more important than browsing initially, was the possibility to send email messages, and it did come with its own little implied email client. So this may not have looked like much, but it certainly did permit people to dial in over modem to some provider and to send some message to somebody and receive messages, and all of that, you know, if you kept it simple with using relatively few data. So that was a certainly very important step in the development of networking in general, that people were suddenly able to exchange information rather momentarily. Things like social networks and so on were still far away or confined to BBSs and such like geek communities, but email was widely accepted in the office world rather swiftly in comparison, one can say. What Windows also made much easier with its version 95 was here in the settings, the control over hardware devices. It was the first operating system to offer something called plug and play, including with wizards like for adding new hardware and showing you in the systems the devices. So it was not just there is some sort of hardware, but you have to fiddle with everything individually. But rather than that, you're having here comparatively easily displayed adapters of graphic cards and whatnot. And if I click here on my computer and watch my Encarta CD-ROM, where I just displayed to you the encyclopedia before, its data is mostly stored on the CD, you see that it is shown no differently than the other drives. It's not like with DOS where you need the Mitsumi CD driver and then you need to bother with setting things up in config sys and auto-exec. But no, instead of that, it rather straightforwardly showed you where you can find your materials, your hardware, your things that you connected to the computer. So that was a great advantage. Of course, no USB yet. But the other thing which it also allowed you was comparatively easy networking. So you did not need to bother with many competing configurations and IRQ conflicts and God knows what. But instead of that, if you wanted to set up TCP/IP, for instance, that was a much more straightforward process, as you can see here, obtain address automatically, than it was previously in earlier versions of Windows. And that was much more user-friendly. It was a nightmare to configure. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but it was a much smaller nightmare than it had been before, and it was much easier for people to actually be able to join that community of faraway computers, somehow called the internet. And it was not clear to people actually how this thing worked. I remember how people at the time were wondering, but if this is not here, if this is on this remote computer, then how can I save it on my computer? You know, these details were not as known to common users as they are nowadays. Now, that said, beware that not all programs are what you would be used to. For instance, if you want to see your IP configuration, ipconfig is not yet available. You had something called WinIP-CFG, and the good old ipconfig is only released in later versions of Windows. Now that we have mentioned some of the more positive points of Windows, let's look also at some things whose design from nowadays perspective is questionable at best. It was Windows 95 that introduced a great use of dynamically linked libraries. Such little pieces of code packaged for programs to peruse their functionality. And if you wanted some form of functionality, you did not necessarily have to incorporate it yourself, but you could say, hey, take one of these DLLs here and just take the needed functionality from there. You see that Windows 95 arrived with quite a lot of them, but it did not particularly well keep track of which are needed, which are not needed, which are in which version, and sometimes you even had competing versions of the same DLL with different functionality, and these problems could not even always be resolved, leading to the expression of DLL hell, where you had different programs with different requirements that in some cases simply could not be reconciled, in particular if some need old functionality and others need new ones. The other thing which Windows introduced in its version 95 is the registry, the central database that is allowing you to explore and change configurations for various things, in many regards being undocumented and not easily understandable by any common user, where you are having all sorts of values, where values could change things in the strangest way, and which gave you a wonderful central place, which if you mess it up, you could deeply mess up your computer entirely. In that regard, I'm not too pleased to see some things, some developments in the Linux world nowadays, which clearly remind of this, right? So now we have had the multimedia aspect, the office use aspect, the email aspect, and it is time perhaps for us to explore a little bit the internet. I want to try something absurd here. I would like to visit a modern website with the antique Internet Explorer 3. Would I like to make it my default browser? Now not. There are setup programs here for Internet Explorer 4 and 5, but I want to see what was 3 like. Let's go really back in time and try visiting, that is ironic, and let's try visiting modern web pages. So the Internet Explorer cannot open the internet site of homemicrosoft.com. Oh, isn't that great? But let me come up with a couple of sites. I'll show a more in-depth demonstration of them in another video that might be possible to be visited. So the first news site or website we will try is 68k.news, and let us see whether our mighty Internet Explorer 3 might be able to reach it without crashing. It's actually a famous site for old computer browsers, and I must say this shows surprisingly nicely. So you're having here lots of news concerning what Trump did today. You are then having something about markets, something about gamers line up for Nintendo Switch 2 launch, and so on and so forth. So I don't know who is Reese Atwood, what is a game winning run that he may have tried or not. Okay, so we did not manage to get that, but maybe we will be able to get one of the other articles. It is assuming here that I am having a US location, which I do not, but in general you at least see the main page. You can at least get a general idea of what is happening in the world on Windows 95 browsing with the Internet Explorer 3. I must say already I do regard as a win. Let's see what is Reuters saying about the Ukrainians hitting Russian planes. And again, so you will have to live mostly with the headlines. Let's try with Bing and its facility to show us news. Classical HTML, compared to these more modern solutions, had the one advantage that things remained culturally accessible. Again, Bing.com News gives me at least some headlines. There's no tabbed browsing because there are no browser tabs invented yet. But http www.EDIT.EXE.news.org How is he? Still dead. God is dead, well, Nietzsche is dead, and he stayed that way. He didn't rise from any grave, but he does have a rather nicely equipped zombie page. So here we're having the Nietzsche news corner. Yeah, we're having 1 million errors about security, JavaScript, and everything which modern websites are expecting. But you see here lectures on Nietzsche for 2024-2025. So again, a modern thing. Yeah, we see here the website rather scrambled. The links seem to be working though. You nowadays have websites which are larger than the memory of the computers which were trying to access them. And we do get some form of information there. So there you go, lovers of Nietzsche. Yeah, things were running that way. Speaking of networking, you know, it's always a little bit of a question how to get things in and out of the system. And as this is a virtual machine, I think you too might be curious as to how can you exchange information? How can you put something into the machine, and how can you get something out of the machine? And I can tell you that the best thing you can do in this specific case, if you allow me to exit here and go to the Linux host, is to exchange information over CD-ROMs as far as information is supposed to go into the machine. But you can also create a netcat listener. So who am I? Yes. And on this netcat listener, netcat is a little information exchange program by which you can connect to something listening on some port. And you can have here simply a listener on port, let's say 9999, and it will now wait for a connection from Windows. And it is interesting to note that the original Hobbit netcat does work for outgoing connections also on Windows 95. And if you go to 10009 on port 9999, then a connection should be established. Hey, hey. But you see it here on the lower left corner of the screen that information can thereby be transported out of the machine. And I can even reply back. Hey there, back. And if I now switch back to Windows, then here we go. So it is, in fact, possible to exchange information this way. There's also another possibility, which is rather entertaining. See, Windows is still of DOS heritage, and DOS, in reference perhaps to even earlier times, is giving you a command called ctty, change teletype, or basically change the command line to one of its serial ports. And you can say, for instance, change the command line to COM1. Now I'm losing control here of Windows, and you see that I cannot do anything further in this window. I can type, but nothing happens. However, if I now go out on my host machine and having wisely taken the precaution to forward in the QEMU virtual machine the serial port to a network port, I can actually connect to localhost, and I say here on my host machine to connect via netcat to localhost 444. And I am now connected to the Windows COM1 serial port where there is nothing yet. But if I now say CTTY COM1, so I'm changing the terminal to COM1, then you see how my Linux host machine is picking them up and it is showing me the Windows desktop from a command line. And if I press dir, then I'm getting a directory listing. And if I say echo, hey there, into a new file, very good. And if I now say notepad new.txt, then you see, you see Notepad is opening the file with the greeting. So you can truly remotely control Windows 95 that way. And it is actually pretty hard to do it any other way, because quite simply, I didn't find any working free telnet server for Windows 95. And if you know of examples what one could use, I would be very curious to hear. Saying ctty con, so return the command to the console, is returning things in Windows properly. And here, if I close Notepad, then you see I'm again at the command line and I can exit and everything is back in order. So I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that gave you a good impression of what Windows 95 was like, what you can do nowadays with it, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you would like to do that, there is one shortcut I might mention as a final thing. I admit that I did not actually configure the machine myself, but rather found something called Windows 95 for UTM on archive.org. So that facilitates a little pleasant adventure a lot. And I hope to greet you here soon again for other exploits. Until then, I wish you a wonderful time. Thank you for watching. See you hopefully soon. And from me, goodbye.